Moderating the panel will be Kate Dargan. She is the founder, chairman of the board, and chief strategy officer of Intterra. She is a 30-year accomplished firefighter, fire chief, and rose through the ranks to become the fire marshal for the state of California. She is a visionary in this field. She understood the capabilities of our community's technologies as it related to her community's challenges. And there's nobody better board member of USGIF, Kate Dargan.
Thank you, Keith. And welcome, audience. This is a passion of mine. I want to say thank you to the entire USGIF organization and all of you for helping the fire community sort through this particular problem. I want to introduce our panel members today. Sitting next to me is Dr. Jim Riley, Director of the USGS. Welcome. Sitting next to him is Jeff Johnson. Jeff is the CEO of the Western Fire Chiefs Association, the past president of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and generally also a board member of the FirstNet, past board member, and connected to most things technology related in the fire community across this country. Rachael Brady is a research data scientist for CAL FIRE and comes to us today with her expertise in geospatial analyst and research in the law enforcement field and firefighting. And finally, we have Jacqueline, our proud winner of the Stu Sage Scholarship Award for her research, her PhD research in post-fire regeneration from the forest perspective. So welcome to all of the panel members. Our first speaker will be Jeff Johnson.
Well, thank you. Good morning. My goal this morning is to create a little context around the problem we're discussing today. And I want to start by talking about the campfire. A lot of us know it as the fire in Paradise, California, and let me just touch on a few highlights. This fire burned 153,000 acres in less than 4 hours. It burned over 14,000 homes, over 5,000 commercial buildings, 84 fatalities. 45 firefighters that were battling this fire, 45 firefighters lost their own homes. From the minute this fire started, around 6:30 in the morning, this fire traveled 6.3 miles in less than an hour and a half. The fuel moisture that morning on the 1,000-hour fuels was 5%, and typical is 17%. The mid-grade fuels actually had fuel moistures below that of kiln-dried lumber. The wind was moving at 25 to 35 miles an hour, constant with 50-mile-an-hour gusts. A fire in those conditions will produce an event called a firenado, which you just saw on the screen. And Northern California had been roughly 200 days absent any rain. From my perspective as a fire chief, a firefighter, and a technologist in the public safety space, this is the time where we bring our ability to analyze data and to understand scientifically what's going on in the environment and find the technological tools that will bring those to the incident commanders. A little bit about how the system works. If you called 911 today and you lived in Redding, the first fire department that shows up is your local fire department. If the resources are too much, if the fire is too big for the local resources, they call in the neighboring fire department. Once it gets above that, or as part of that, you bring in CAL FIRE, or the state fire department. And then lastly, you bring in federal resources, which also tends to bring along private contractors. So there really are, in California, there's 3 levels. In most states, to about the 95th percentile, there's 2 layers. Local community fire department, then the federal fire department. California is one of the few states that actually has a statewide fire department. So there's 2 layers, whereas in law enforcement, there can be at any given point 16 or 17 layers of law enforcement. In fire, there's 2. The fascinating thing about fire, I think, is that if you're a firefighter, here's what you inherently know. Fire does not move in a wildfire context by direct flame contact. Fire, it's wind-driven, it's topography-driven, it's fuels-driven, and it leaps ahead of itself in a preheating fashion, oftentimes by a mile or 2 through what's known as ember cast. This ember cast is what creates all the spot fires and actually allows the fire to jump ahead of itself, then burn into itself and further accelerate it. That's how the fire moved 6.3 miles in less than an hour and a half. I was talking to the incident commander, Chief David Hawks of CAL FIRE, and I asked him about the first minute they knew they had a problem in Paradise, California. Now remember, the fire started 6 miles away. At about 6:30, at 8 a.m., they had a half-acre fire in Paradise. The first arriving officer said, "We have a half-acre fire. I believe it's connected to the main fire up the canyon," and asked for an evacuation of roughly a third of the city, which he quickly appended to mean the entire city. Over 40,000 people moved out of Paradise and the surrounding communities, and they had to do so immediately. All the roads were ordered contraflow, and the fire quickly overtook the evacuation, which led to a lot of the fatalities. Once the fire gets in a community, it quits being a wildfire and it turns into an urban conflagration where my house is catching your house on fire, and then it just builds on that. Meanwhile, the wildfire has casted itself well beyond the community. The data that we are collecting today, and there is a lot of data being collected, but the data will feed and drive things like code adoption, improved methodologies for firefighters, transportation route planning, coordination, and plans that save lives and frankly allow us to build homes that are more resistant to fire. The learnings that we're getting, however, often are slow to find their way to the field commander, and this is exacerbated in some regard by the fact that we don't have technology yet connecting the incident commander. The incident commander in a wildfire setting are still, in many cases, throwing paper maps across the hood of their vehicle, when in fact we know the technology exists to create a real-time situational awareness of what's going on in that fire and allow us to make decisions about who, what, and where. I think the real challenge is how to take the science-based evidence and learnings that we are collecting, how to put those into thought and practice and move those to the incident commander in real time. Leave you with this last thought. It's fascinating to me that I can watch a hurricane approach Miami, and I can watch that in real time in the American model and in the European model. If there's a tsunami or an earthquake, I know that instantly where and what. But even the incident commander on a wildfire doesn't understand what's really going on with that fire until 24 hours later. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. So I'm going to present for a few minutes and try to talk to specifically the geointelligence community and talk to you about where we are in California, around the Western United States, trying to create a state of readiness using the technology that so many of you are working on. I do that, one, through the company that Keith referred to. Intterra is a AWS-based cloud operating system, common operating platform for the fire service. We connect fire departments at the federal, state, and local level all across the United States. Over 10,000 firefighters currently using that system, from everything from structure fires, medical aids, and wildfires. Today, we're going to focus on this wildfire question. And why is it intractable? Why does Chief Johnson say that today the wildfire incident commander is still working off of a hood of a truck with paper and pen when the technology exists to serve them better? A couple of the reasons that we struggle with that issue is legacy wildfire strategies are built on a 100-year-old methodology. We invented this mechanism, this methodology of fighting fire back in the day of mules and shovels, and we have not substantially changed that methodology to today. It's very stuck in that traditional way of problem solving. So we have to overcome different innovative ways of even approaching the problem of firefighting. The second is, and many of the warfighters understand this is a culture of tactical. It is about what I can do right now, in this moment, with the simple tools that I have at hand. I'll solve the problem first, and I'll figure the rest out later. That tactical culture needs to remain in place, but served with technology. And finally, from a California perspective, our community losses over the last several decades have been relatively stable. If we look at the last several 30 years of wildfire losses, we discover that we are just beginning a J-curve, an inflection point of losses, where 10 and 15, 20 years ago, our structure losses were in the hundreds, a few thousand houses at a time lost. We are now in the multiples of thousands on single incidents. We have spent $40 billion of money in the last 2 years dealing with the insurance, recovery, and firefighting costs in the state of California. That's $40 billion in the last 2 years. That is unacceptable. Today, the firefighting environment has transitioned from that mule and shovel technology to the pace of combat. I chose this slide here just to give you a picture of the environment the firefighter operates in, the gear, the isolation, the fact that the fire is igniting hundreds of structures around them, and their information is limited on what's occurring. I also chose this slide so you would note that what is on fire are houses, what is not on fire are trees. That's a very important part of this equation. This is tactical combat in an urban environment, or suburban, I should say, to be more precise. So how do we change that paradigm? How do we start to shift? How do we use technology tactically? That's part of it. How do we serve up the right products, decision support systems, and information in that environment at the pace of the decisions they need? How do we increase the scale and tempo of decision-making across the whole force? How do we automate things like alerts so that data doesn't overwhelm the tactical firefighter? How do we get evacuation information into the public awareness at the same time the firefighters are aware of it? And how do we do location tracking across thousands of individuals in a confined environment? Using remote sensing routinely, I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, and accepting that firefighting strategies have changed. We are firefighting differently than we did before. So here's an example. I wanted to point out the state of Colorado has 2 multi-mission aircraft up to recently, I think even including now. This is basically the state of the art in the tactical wildfire community. These are 2 aircraft that are dispatched to all large and going fires in the state of Colorado, works with an EO/IR sensor, onboard air processing, air cell downlink to the internet, and disseminated and displayed to the firefighters within a 10-minute time frame, from time of collection to the time it's showing up on the firefighters' mobile phones. Firefighters have that on demand at their fingertips. Next to that is a product showing heat sensors. This product started to be available about 10 years ago in the firefighting community. That company is now out of business because the market wasn't ready for it. But what the firefighters need is both IR imagery in the FMV categories, but also shapefile perimeters that they can see themselves against the fire line. Could I have the video, please, for just the first minute or 2? This is an example of the state of Colorado, just the view that the firefighters are able to get on their mobile phones. And thank you for the video. Can we go to the slide? Training the firefighting community to use the Intel products that are currently being provided. This slide is an example of Maxar's worldview into the U.S. Forest Service's Common Operating Platform. This last year in 2018, as the firefighting also available on demand, mobily, from any firefighter logged into the system. They pull this up, they see it when they want to. They're able to manipulate the scene. 86 different collection requests, 4,700 scenes, and over 4,500 products served up to the firefighters. I bring this statistic to the group today so that you can see the firefighting community is beginning to learn how to use the products. This is the early indicators of the adopters out there. We also have a process nationally that has just been started up this last year called the National Incident Feature Service. Every wildland firefighter in the country is now collaboratively mapping, when they collaboratively map, and putting that into a single authoritative data source that can be served out as a REST service. We have, over this last year, 19,000 fires in this system and over 500,000 edits to that system. Again, proof that the firefighters are beginning to trust their technology and use it. Other things that are of interest, and Dr. Riley will expand on this, also State of Colorado, the National Center for Atmospheric Research has begun 3D coupled weather modeling, dimensional modeling over the fires of both surface fire behavior and three-dimensional wind patterns. That is done processing on large computers offsite, but the fire perimeters you'll see on the left side of the screen, excuse me, the right side of the screen, are beginning to be displayed as they are derived and into that same mobile application that firefighters can use. So we're seeing the early beginnings of fire prediction based on weather, fuels, and topography in a very robust analytics environment, but served up simply to the fire community. Also new this year, the U.S. Forest Service, in partnership with DOD, the USGS, and the Civil Applications Center, has connected unclassified material, so we now have point detection of fires across the country, automated and served up, so that we now see fire starts occurring in an automated environment for all firefighters logged into their common operating platforms. That prototype began in 2010, has been tested over the years, and in 2015 became the detection portion of that, was approved to share across the fire community. And lastly, just rolled off the presses 48 hours ago or so, again, the Civil Applications Center, USGS, in partnership with U.S. Forest Service as a federal approving agency. Now the California National Guard has the ability to manually transcribe those perimeters into persistent 24/7, every 15-minute fire shapefile updates real-time to the firefighting community. That is a huge forward step that we just turned on this year. Colorado National Guard looking over their shoulder, ready to adopt as well. Kudos to all of you who've been a part of that if you're in the audience today. So I'll close with talking about what do we need tomorrow? What are the things that we need to point at? 3D coupled terrain and weather models. We have most every fire model that's out there is based on two-dimensional surface-based fuels and progression modeling, and the wind component is absent from that in a significant way. We need more three-dimensional weather modeling. We need high-resolution fuel models that are starting to fuse LiDAR and hyperspectral data in a publicly or governmentally available way at the resolution. Once again, we're talking about getting into the structure environment, at the resolution that we can do very precise analytics with. Buildings as a fuel type. As these fires conflagrate into our communities, we know nothing about how that fire spread occurs, how the multiple ignitions by the hundreds, how the structure-to-structure ignition occurs, and what kind of heat analysis to assume for a building on fire, and how that will adjacently radiate out to the different cells around that in terms of a modeling. Don't know anything about that yet. Geospatial AI modeling of fire suppression effectiveness. As we put AVLs on equipment and individual GPS resources, which is occurring in a few more years, most every firefighter will be tracked and every vehicle will be tracked. And we start to marry that against the fire perimeter and remote sensing we have. We need to start applying AI learning to the suppression effectiveness and the actions they are taking on that archive data. I'll talk a little bit about something in our company. A shout out to AWS and the image recognition program. We're busy trying to train the imagery and the knowledge that we have at Intterra into wildfire recognition processes so that we can automate more and more of what we're seeing. And lastly, I'm going to say there is a lot of discussion about what real time is. And I ask that question every time I talk to anyone associated with it. What does real time mean? It is a moving target. So for lack of a better, I propose that in the firefighting, wildfire fighting community, what real time means from our perspective is we need a persistent fire perimeter. I need to know where the fire is at all times. I need to know where I am against that fire perimeter. I need to know where my forces next to me are. I need to know that at the minimum of 1 square meter resolution. And I need to know that what is collected and served to me on my mobile device is no more than 2 minutes old. I need to see that in a shapefile so I can put other data with it. That's what real time would mean to me. I challenge the community, come talk to me. Make it better. If I'm off target, great. But for lack of better, that's the bullseye that we should be aiming at. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Riley.
Okay. Thank you, Kate.
Well, good morning. I'm here as the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, but I've also got a background in GEOINT, having worked 17 years as a reservist for the Navy, primarily teaching the Navy how to use space assets. And so I kind of come at this from a slightly different perspective on this. We're going to talk a little bit about what's the importance to the USGS in terms of what we do for wildland fire characterization. And it really comes down to a critical set of needs. And the critical needs we have is reliable characterization of the threat. We need to be able to deliver speed of information fast enough for critical decisions to be made. It's going to echo a couple of things that we've already heard about today, and that's one you hear over and over again these days, the artificial intelligence machine learning piece. Because to be able to get to that very low latency of information, we're going to have to get the humans out of the loop, and we recognize that. Because it's all about closing the OODA loop for the firefighter, the observe, orient, decide, and act, because they're fighting an enemy that really is at the act stage, and they got to get there faster. So that's how we're looking at it. And to do that, we need to provide the firefighters with the information as quickly as possible from that digital realm through the AI/ML layer, so that they have it as what I've shamelessly stolen from the NRO is calling the Internet of Action. In other words, the very first thing that I see when I make a request is something I can do something with. Now, nested in that, of course, are a lot of requirements, and so I'm going to touch on a few of the things. And so over the next few slides, what I'm going to do is just sort of introduce what we're doing at USGS now, and then I'm going to finish up with an animation that's from the National Center for Atmospheric Research on a particular fire that you guys will remember when we get there. And we'll look at what kind of information could we get, and then ask the question, would that be tactically useful to the firefighter? So the first slide here, these are a series of products that the USGS puts together. This is one called Wildfire. And basically what it does, it defines the threat. And so we're constantly looking at basically three things: fuel loads, fuel structure, and then ecological departures, which, as Jeff mentioned, when we talk about the relative humidity within the fuels, that's the ecological departures. But it also considers changes in the ecology. So in some areas where you've had sagebrush and the sagebrush is burned, there's a particular species called cheatgrass, so when it comes in, it's literally explosively incendiary. And so it changes the fire dynamics. And so you have to look at it from a different perspective and how you can prepare for that. But with Wildfire, it's really not a real-time tool at all, but what it is a planning tool. In fact, what I understand that a lot of the firefighters use this for is really looking at where are the high threat areas coming into the fire season so they can pre-position assets, and then also look at what they have as primary and secondary evacuation routes. And so that's the piece that we put into it, are those three things that we talked about: the fuel loads, the structure, and the ecological departures. The next piece is we're mapping the entire country with LiDAR, and the whole reason there is to get high precision topography, digital topography. And it changes our understanding of what's going on around, in this particular case, the fires themselves. Where's the drainages? Because that's where the high fuel loads are usually located. And what we found, and we knew this going into it, is that at 1 to 100,000 scale, which is our topographic layer across the US today, it's not good enough. And so we're now mapping it at 1 to 24,000. And what that means is that for all those drainages that we just talked about, we can see 10 times more and characterize these far better than we could. And we're not going to do it just once, we're actually going to do it twice. We're going to come back after we finish this next one, or this next pass at 1 to 24,000 scale, and do another one at 1 to 5,000 scale. And again, the whole idea is to characterize the battle space better. How much of that can we do airborne? We're doing all of it airborne right now, but we're asking the question, what can we do with spaceborne assets as well? And we're looking at that. In fact, there's a couple of NASA satellites up right now that have some potential that we're examining in places like Alaska. But with our LiDAR, we can look at two things: topography and also the structure of the forest canopy. If you've been around fires, and I've been around several in Colorado, you'll notice that it doesn't burn everything. It will quite often, in the lower intensity areas, it'll burn the underbrush and leave the canopies. You still have a fire load in those areas. LiDAR is a perfect way to characterize that existing canopy or the preserved canopy as well. So many fires will do just partial damage to no damage to the canopy, except in the very hottest ones. And then what you'll see in this animation on the fire here in a second is that those really hot zones are very spotty. They're not everywhere. And so you'll see that there's a lot of fuel left in it, which is actually one of the situations that we ran into here. When we get into the wildland fires, this is a product that we put out daily, usually on a 4 to 6 hour cycle. And it's one that can actually be drilled down into, but it's a multi-source piece of information. And so, mentioned earlier the National Center where we do our civilian applications collaboration, and that is basically everybody that's probably in this room. You have a representative. If you're a government ent, you probably have a representative in that NCAC, which is one of the committees that I chair. And we take the information not only from NGA but commercial sources as well as our national systems, and put it all together into this map that you see here to help characterize where are the hot spots. And this goes out to the National Interagency Fire Center, and this then gets disseminated out to the incident commanders at least twice a day, usually more often. Is it a real-time product? Nope, not yet. Could it be? That's a good question. We'd like to make it a lot better, and we're going to come back to that here in a minute. And then this last piece, getting from the vegetation metrics from 3DEP and LiDAR. 3DEP is that 3D elevation program I mentioned a minute ago. So there's the two pieces. What does the elevation model look like? What's the ground? And then there's the vegetation piece. What's the characterization of the vegetation? And so between those two things, we want to be able to process that faster, get to that Internet of Action. And so when you see that Amazon AWS cloud in the upper right, we're moving towards that in a big way. We want to try to get to that AI ML applications piece so that, again, we get to that Internet of Action, close the OODA loop for the firefighter, right? Get that information in, push it out as fast as we can, and push it out to the firefighter. So we're working on that closely. Here's one as a GeoMac application. This one's really just strategic situational awareness. This is where fires are or have been. You can drill down on any of those spots, get more information as you look at it. But here's the tactical piece, obviously. Gets into the thermal infrared. And as Kate pointed out, Colorado has 2 multi-mission aircraft, but having lived in Colorado for a decade before I got pulled off to DC, there's often more than 2 fires going on in Colorado. So getting these overhead assets is absolutely critical. And so this is the tactical piece, right? So this is the next place we want to get to characterize. And then even after the fire's done, our job's not done, because there's still a number of threats that if you followed the ones in California recently, we had an anomalously wet fall right after the fires. What did that mean? We now have wet soils. We don't have any biomass holding the soils in place. The soils actually change chemistry when they are in those really hot regimes where you get to the 1,000 to 3,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. Actually changes the absorption of the water within the soils. You get more runoff. We need to be able to characterize that. That's actually a part of what we do in our landslide hazards piece, but we need to do a lot more. And that's where we get to the remote characterization of this battle space again. How do we see this threat and identify the variables and control those variables so that we can deliver the warnings, particularly when we have 1 to 2 days at most forecast on the heavy rains that you saw post-fire in California. So that's what we're trying to get to. Now with this one, I want to, as this animation on the left progresses, this is the Yarnell Hills fire. If you remember, this is where we lost 19 firefighters in the Granite Mountain Hotshot team. They were down in the southeast of the fires you see it. The outline of the fire is there on the right. And what you're seeing here is an animation that was put together by Janice Cohen at NCAR. And so you're seeing more of the wind patterns within the field, but one of the things that's interesting to note is you see as the fire propagates, it actually moves around quite a bit, and that's a combination of the topography and the microenvironment. The fire, as you saw in Jeff's little tornado video, at the beginning, controls the microenvironment quite a lot. And so you see the fire as it progresses, it moves around, and then as you see those flashes of light, that's where those really strong and hot occurrences happen. That's where the canopies are ignited. But notice that only happens in a few places. Now, right now you see this big gust front that's coming across from a collapsing thunderstorm, and now you'll see that southern part of the fire reignite. And the Granite Hills boys were coming down that hillside into that fire thinking they were moving into a already evacuated terrain or where the fuels had been exhausted. Obviously, they had not. And as a consequence, they never saw it coming. In fact, if you listen to the video and the audio, their situational awareness was pretty close to zero. They weren't even on the observe part of the OODA loop, so they had no opportunity to decide and act until it was way too late. Could we put this kind of a tool in their hands? This is where we want to get to. How do we get that information, get it from all the sources, multi-int? How do we fuse that multi-int? How do we shove it out through the communications pathway out to the guys out front where they can see it on something like this? Everybody should be able to see that picture on something that looks just like that. So this is where we're going right now. We have a fire and smoke model evaluation experiment that characterizes everything we can, including the microenvironment. And we're working with a number of our collaborators right now to get a better understanding of the physics and the chemistry of the fires, what happens in the microenvironments, working with NOAA and the National Weather Service, working with NCAR, working with U.S. Forest Service, working with state and local partners, and also some elements of DoD to try to characterize the fire. What can we see from all the systems that we have available to us? How do we fuse that information, make that a multi-int deliverable? How do we put it into FirstNet and get it out to the firefighters so that they can see and get the situational awareness they need to get that done? That's going to be collaborative, not just government, not just with the states. It's going to be with everybody, including the private sector as far as we're concerned. And so what are the next steps for us? Is we really need to take the data fusion to as far down the real-time capability as we can. We're doing AI/ML across the USGS for all the things that we do, which this is just one very small part of our hazards obligations. But we're looking at that AI/ML activity to increase our speed of science to the decision. And that's where we want to close that OODA loop no matter what we're talking about, whether it's earthquakes in California, whether it's wildfires in California, elsewhere, whether it's volcanoes in California. California is sort of the poster child for disasters, I'm thinking. But pretty much everywhere across the country, including the slow-moving disasters that we're seeing right now in Arkansas, the flooding that's coming down the Mississippi, all of those are things that we want to be able to characterize much better. So that's our challenge in front of us, and we look forward to working with all of you. By the way, you're our customers. If you have needs, we're here to help deliver them for you. So we're here to serve you, and we would love to have your opportunity to come in and tell us what you need. Thank you very much.
We're good. Thank you. Continue to bring your questions forward by text, or I don't know if you can bring them up by hand, but certainly text them in. I do have a couple of already, and if I don't get any more, I'll invent my own. One of them is probably best fielded by myself, so I'll try to get that out of the way. What is the fire anticipation for California this fall? Who knows? And I say that not too flippantly, because literally our world has been turned upside down in the last few years, and things beyond our expectations have occurred. We knew that fuel moistures had been low, as Chief Johnson pointed out. Paradise, kiln-dried lumber, I think, is at 6%, and the fuel humidity, or the fuel moisture was at 3% in Paradise. That means literally the standing wood was less than kiln-dried lumber. But this year, we've had the wettest May on record, the wettest, coldest May on record for California, which means we have a profusion of still green fuels and 2 years of the worst ever fire histories. So we're poised at the edge of anything for this summer, and aren't quite sure. We'll be watching the weathers and the fuel moistures and all of our sensors, weather stations closely, and trying to do the best to predict. But once you've had your tree shaken as hard as California has, you just stand forward and say, we're expecting anything. The second question, we always hear about firefighters actively battling fires, but what preventative measures are taken prior to fire conditions? And so I'm going to stop there and ask Chief Johnson and Dr. Riley if you have any thoughts on what preventive measures taken prior to fire conditions can we be pointed at? I'll start with Chief Johnson.
Well, I think aggressive fuel mitigation, of course, is going on. Professor Toomey out of University of Oregon recently presented data at a wildfire summit, and the prediction was if you treated 50% of the forests that need treatment, it would still have an increase over 90% in fire frequency and severity. If you treated 90% of the available forests that need it, you're still going to experience, over the next decade, you're still going to see nearly a 50% increase. So what we're hearing is climate is a big factor. Treatment helps, but we're still going to get fires more severe. I think what we have to do is have buildings in the path of wildfire be more resistant to the wildfire.
Good point. Dr. Riley, any thoughts?
Well, two thoughts come immediately to mind, and Jeff just mentioned one of them, and that is characterization of climate change, because climate does change obviously across the planet as a whole, but even more critically locally. Characterizing that local climate and the changes and looking out 2 to 3 years is where we're trying to get to, and to be able to characterize that. And that's a interagency response in terms of how we're trying to approach that. And that's just part of what we do at USGS, but the other part is the land use piece, which gets to the fire mitigation. The big challenges that we have in states like California and even Alaska and certainly in Colorado and Wyoming is that the urban areas are moving out, and as they move further and further out, you put more of these structures in the threat regime. And so you have to recognize that there's a mitigation piece that has to go with that. That gets into the local codes and some other requirements, but as Chief Johnson just mentioned, is that when you get into defining what it is that you expect the homeowner to do, it needs to be very clear. It needs to be have some teeth behind it as far as setting the building codes so that you can do that, and also require periodic mitigation. In fact, one of the lessons we learned in Colorado Springs, where I lived, was the one friend of mine whose house survived in mountain shadows, and 2 other friends on either side of him lost their houses. He had just completed the fire mitigation, and it didn't take much to do that, right? So you have to characterize what it is that you expect to have happen, model it, combine that with the weather forecasting, the climate aspects of it, and look at where you want to focus your resources. And that, again, is a collaborative effort on the part of all of us to get to that point.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. I want to say thank you to both Jacqueline and Rachael for joining us today. I'm going to try to wrap up on time, which is exactly at this moment. But I want to point out that you work with the sensors and the wildfire part, kind of in your day-to-day job, Rachael. And I'm sure that there are some things that you'd like to have had technology-wise at your fingertips this last year. I wish I had time to explore that with you, but maybe you'll be back in the GEOINT community as a continuing member and contributing to that. And Jacqueline, good luck with your research. We'll expect to see you back with some reports on that in the next few years as you complete your PhD. And thank you to the audience.